Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Action Research in the Classroom. We're going to get into Session 3 material for this screencast. So just to do a quick review and recap from Session 2, you just completed the Action Research article Jigsaw and had the opportunity to review the posts of your classmates for the articles that you had not yet reviewed, and also had the opportunity to engage in some dialogue and shared knowledge around your thinking based on what you read in the articles that were provided. So lots of good discussion opportunities to engage and thinking around some of the topics. One of the conversations that I thought was really robust was some of the thinking around school-wide action research versus the individuality of the process and the value in using a school-wide model for professional development and really school improvement. So nice work and thinking around those topics in those articles. So I appreciate the engagement. We also had the opportunity to look at an activity on revising action research questions. Again, that was just kind of a stretch activity. It was kind of a warm-up to get you engaged in the process of thinking about how you develop your questions and how you have the right amount of specificity and trying to really pinpoint through the development of a strong question what your research will entail. So that was meant to be kind of, again, a warm-up as we get into the depth of the project here in the next week. I also asked you to read Mertler, Chapter 3, and then complete 2 research article abstracts for the week and post in the forum. So the 2 article abstracts in particular, just a reminder that as you review the topics that were submitted by your peers, any of those articles that others may have contributed to the forum where those were posted, you may utilize in your own projects if you find them to be of value. So part of the method in creating that abstract assignment, number 1, was to stair-step you into starting your research and kind of honing in and identifying your topic, but also getting you into the APA style and the first stages of writing and developing the quick abstracts, and also a shared research base for our class. So again, you are welcome to use any of those that are posted by others. That's fair game. This week, we're going to look at Mertler, Chapter 4 and Chapter 8, and specifically Chapter 4 is going to help you review the research plan. So you're going to look at different ways for developing a research plan. Mertler will get into a little bit of information about research design. He'll talk about qualitative and quantitative and mixed method. We're not going to worry too much about defining which way we go, but you will be getting into your data plans in the next week or so, and I'll encourage you as you start thinking about finalizing the question for your research, you'll want to think about what type of data will you be able to collect around your question, and you will have 3 different sources of data that you'll be utilizing. So thinking about the legs of a stool, you'll want 3 different pieces of data to help you know whether or not your interventions are making a difference in the practice and in the learning environment within your classroom. So it doesn't really matter if they're qualitative, quantitative, or a little bit of both, which would be a mixed method design. We're not going to worry about really defining the design of the project. We're just going to figure out 3 ways to collect data so that you can know whether or not you're making a difference. So Mertler does a nice job of describing the different things and the different data sources, and will also give you an opportunity to start to think about what type of data sources you want to utilize. That doesn't have to be done this week, but again, we're kind of getting prepared and building the base knowledge that we'll build upon as we get into the data methodology section of the project in the next week or so. So this week, you'll also get into finalizing the action research question and submit the final research question. One of the things I asked you to do last week, and several of you have already done so, but just send me a quick email and let me know what question you're going to land on so that I have an opportunity to ask some questions about that, or maybe give you some coaching to help you further refine that question before you get started into writing the first section of the project that will be drafted this week. So if you didn't email me your research question last week, please do so before you really get into starting your first draft this week. You'll also develop the draft sections of the Action Research Project, which this week I will have you turn into me the introduction, which is the very first section of the project, and you'll also start drafting the research support for change. That's the second section in the project. So you'll follow the APA format. I also have a writing guide that will be posted this week in Moodle that will stair-step you into how to lay out each section and how to have the section subheadings so that you are clearly developing those first stages of the draft. I will give you information back, feedback on those draft sections as soon as those are turned in. Usually it takes me 24 to 48 hours to get feedback to you. With smaller class numbers, it's a lot faster for me. When we have full sections or full sections beyond, it takes me a little bit more time, but I do try and be as responsive in turning those around to you as I can. The last thing that we'll do is, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I will work to try and get some research teams put together, if not this week, the following week, based on what I see in the projects you're submitting and common areas of research that might be good for your review and your collaboration. So that's on my plate, and you will hear more about that in the coming weeks. So I also wanted to share briefly, just if you haven't already encountered them, that some of the resources that I've posted the last couple of weeks in Moodle are there, again, just for your information. You have an opportunity to look at some sample action research projects that have been posted in Session 1 and Session 2, and specifically those are PDF files. One was done in the Omaha Public School District, and that's changing Omaha's classrooms. So it's a range of middle school, high school projects. So you get some ideas there. And the other was the link that came out of the Kansas Professional Development Schools. So those were all basically student teachers and interns as they went into their very first classroom experience. And many of the Kansas PDS schools in the past required an action research project, so those documents just came from that program. So they're just, again, meant to be resources to help you engage in your thinking about instructional change that you might want to study. This week I'm providing, and just as a guide, a couple of past projects. Now keep in mind the past projects were done before Baker made the switch over into APA, so please don't get hung up on the style, but they're meant to just, again, provide some insight into how others have developed the action research projects. It gives you an idea about their writing style, the formality of the research writing, which Mertler gets into in Chapter 8. And gives you some ideas about conventions and style guides and so forth. But they're just meant to be a resource, and that there will be some things that I will coach you through. I don't want you to get hung up on the details, because there have been a couple of students that have said, well, it wasn't this way in the exemplar. So if I give you feedback, please know that those exemplars are meant to, again, just be examples, and I will give you some coaching points along the way as we start drafting the project. So now we'll get into the introduction to the research methodologies. I want to stair-step you a little bit into thinking about the research plan. And again, this is kind of tying back to Mertler Chapter 4, but I'm also going to pull some research and references from Sager, another text, and he wrote about the data collection plan. We'll start crafting these parts in a more formal way with additional information for you next week, but I, again, just want to kind of get you thinking as you finalize your action research topic, you focus on the question. The next point is going to be to start to think about how you're going to know whether or not you make a difference, and what are those data collection tools. So again, we talked about last week the difference between action research and traditional research. And some of the common points that we're going to focus on now is that both use methods to collect the data using some of the similar procedures: asking questions, observing behaviors, using existing data gathered by others. And so I want you to think about that in terms of, we're asking our questions and developing those focus questions for the research right now. Hopefully, whether it's been intentional or whether it's now you can reflect back, but just in thinking about what questions you want to focus on for the project, you probably have been more keen at observing the behaviors that are happening in your classroom. Maybe it's interactions with students, maybe it is work habits of students, maybe it is interactions that you're having in the classroom as the lead instructor or facilitator for the learning. But through the research process, we'll be observing behaviors, and that could be a focus for your data collection, is some of the observations that you're making. That could be one of your data tools, depending on the focus for your project. So that is why we want to talk about that a little bit now. The existing data gathered by others, I want you to also start thinking about what existing data do you have already collected in a format that would be accessible to you. So depending on what your research topic is, if you're looking at behaviors, office referral data is probably already collected by your school. So that might give you a longitudinal pre and possibly a post intervention measure of data that's already being collected in a form that you wouldn't necessarily have to do anything different to access. So that is something to think through. How can you work smarter and access data sources that are already in place? Qualitative and quantitative data, I mentioned that briefly, and Mertler will get into more detail about different qualitative and quantitative data sources. In fact, I'll draw your attention to page 91 in chapter 4, where he starts to talk about should you use a qualitative or a quantitative approach. That'll give you some ideas for different types of data and how they might be viewed in terms of what you might be looking for in the project. So if you've got a broad research topic, you may be looking at more qualitative data. Maybe you're going to have students, respond to a prompt. Maybe you're going to use an exit ticket with an open-ended prompt that will give students an opportunity to give you some pretty broad feedback in knowing about a change that you're making. So anyway, that table's kind of handy, but there are, again, a wealth of resources there. And then think about some shared data collection tools, and those might be, again, maybe you've got access to data collection tools that already exist within the building. Maybe if you're looking at change in behaviors, some of your resources, whether it's a school psychologist or your special education team, they may have some great data collection tools that are already in place and being utilized that you may not have encountered just because of the nature of your role. So again, engage in that collaborative process and talk to your colleagues once you start to really hone in on your topic, so that we are maximizing the resources we have at our fingertips. I mentioned earlier the triangulation of data, and one of the things that is kind of helpful there in that data triangulation is having 3 different sources. So as some of you had emailed and started to identify your action research topic, I've asked questions about how do you think you might measure this? So I'm hopefully starting to get you thinking in terms of what are the ways that you'll know about the difference and that you will have 3 distinct sources. So one of the things that when I did my PhD research, I was looking at changes in at-risk learners through the integration of technology, the intentional use of technology in reading and math at the upper elementary grades. And so the ways I collected data, I included a classroom observation tool that I'll share with you a little bit later, because I've had a number of students utilize that same tool in the action research process because it's a pretty easy tool to utilize. So I did classroom observations, and I looked at types of questioning and the interactions that were happening at different phases of a lesson. I also looked at learner engagement at a certain time. So I basically did a time on task analysis. And then I also looked at wide range achievement data, which was more of a norm referenced exam. And that would give me pre and post data for the learner. So I had 3 distinct ways of knowing whether or not a change was happening. So it's just important. And then the screencast is covering up the other example, but it's a 2-legged stool that's fallen over. So the 3 legs, the 3 data points are meant to help strengthen your research and really help you identify whether or not a significant change is being made. The challenge that we'll have in action research for this class is the time frame of our semester. We've got 7 weeks. We've got less than 7 weeks now. So really you'll have a good 2 weeks, maybe, depending on school schedules, and knock on wood, the weather, if we're in the fall semester, to make sure, well, I guess I won't even say that, it could be spring as well, to get the data collection in. We've got a short window of time. So that's okay. We'll work with it, but just know that those are limitations we can use and write about in the final stages of the research project. We'll talk about some of the limitations to the research, and time may be one. The extended time that we have in this class will be a limitation that we write about. And future direction of the study would include further data collection. That's okay, so don't worry about that. We will make a lemonade out of our lemons. No worries. So this next slide I wanted to share with you because it gives you some ways to think about different observational methods. So these are all just different ways to think about data gathering strategies, and some of the ones that are covered up by the screencast I'll just talk through. So in addition to class discussions or interactions, I've had teachers utilize classroom meetings as a data collection tool, and they just kind of script it out or made notes as the classroom meetings were happening, or did a quick journal entry at the conclusion of the class meeting to kind of capture what was discussed and what the feedback from students were, the interactions. I've had teachers utilize interviews. Sitting down with small groups of students or one-on-one to interview students to get their feedback. They have analyzed portfolios or even kept portfolios of work or journals. Observation I've alluded to in my own research. I did a time on task analysis. I'll share the data collection tool with you before we end tonight. Questionnaires or surveys, videotapes, photography. I had an art teacher a few years ago that really wanted to work on students in creating more ownership in the class, and so also cutting down on transition time. So really wanted them to take ownership and help not only be a part of the learning and the lesson and the environment, but be taking pride in that and helping clean up at the conclusion of their time, which ultimately helped her extend her ability to be serving as an instructional leader in that classroom. So she documented the progress with some of the interventions she implemented by taking photos of before and after the classroom to see whether or not students were really taking greater ownership and maintaining the environment. Easy, super easy. So just think about observation in different ways that you can collect data. And this is just meant to be a resource for you to think and extend your thinking. We talked already a little bit about the difference between qualitative and quantitative. So again, just gives you a little bit more information between the different types. So more qualitative on the side, all research ultimately has a qualitative grounding. And then when I started getting into research and I realized that so much of what I thought was qualitative could actually have a numerical value assigned to it and be quantitative, that kind of changed my thinking. So Curlinger's quote, "There's no such thing as a qualitative data, everything is either a 1 or a 0. If you start to thinking about it, even if you do interviews with students, you can turn that into somewhat of a qualitative assessment, because if you start hearing the same statements over and over, the same types of feedback, you can classify that and quantify that, even though it may start out seeming as qualitative data. So we can work through that as we get deeper into your data collection, but it's just something to keep in mind. So more on the quantitative side is data is in the form of numbers, where qualitative, it can be in the form of words, pictures, and objects. So just a couple of different ways to distinguish. Data collection tools. Now let's get a little bit more specific. Questionnaires. Those could be a data collection tool where you're asking questions of the students and getting feedback. One of the exemplar research projects that I think I shared had to do with learning styles, and so part of identifying how students learn best included getting to know your students, and you can do that through questionnaires. Questionnaires on feelings, thoughts, behaviors. Questionnaires have even been used in kindergarten and preschool classrooms, and those questionnaires, instead of having a lot of words, they may be asking students to respond to a prompt and then circle their feelings. Maybe there's a happy face or a sad face, and students can articulate how they feel about something in the form of a questionnaire, even if they do not yet have high literacy skills or abilities. So there's a lot of different ways to accomplish the data collection through a questionnaire. Likert scale questionnaires are another way to work. So a couple of things that you'll learn if you're doing Likert scales or survey research. There is a methodology. There's a lot of research behind how surveys are constructed. So if you're asking questions and you are giving a Likert scale response, there's really no right or wrong, but you need to think about how do you want to collect your data. Do you want to give an odd number of responses where you're giving a middle point in the road? There's some thinking that that is a good thing, and others that say only give an even number of response possibilities and force someone to take a side. So eliminate the middle, eliminate the neutral, and if you go with a 4-scale Likert, you're going to force someone to either agree or disagree, and not a lot of difference between strongly agree or strongly disagree. You're forcing them into a position. So just think about what do you want to know, and how do you want your respondents to respond, and do you want to give them a middle? Or do you want to know whether or not they're completely indifferent? So again, I always use my questions as my guide, and I always think about what do I really want to know. And that leads me to how I structure those Likert scales, whether I give them an odd or an even. Okay. Other response examples. We talked a little bit more on the qualitative side about giving open-ended thoughts. versus structured thoughts. If you go structured thoughts, you can typically quantify those versus open-ended. You're getting more qualitative. And then you can do some structured behaviors. So asking in terms of frequency, that's what that is getting at, and how you would quantify based on frequency of a behavior. Questionnaire. So some things to think about. The advantages of doing a questionnaire: open-ended questions created quickly and easily. They're quick to complete for respondents. The chance to learn some unexpected information is greater, especially if you're doing some open-ended questions. And questions with rating scales can be scored quickly. So some of the disadvantages is open-ended responses can sometimes be ambiguous. And if you're doing these in a questionnaire where you're not having an interview, you don't have the opportunity to follow back oftentimes and get deeper clarity. So that's where that ambiguity can sometimes be a challenge. Analysis of open-ended takes research time. It's going to take you more time to go through, but again, when you're working with your classroom or even a subset of your classroom, sometimes you can get some very, very interesting responses that you never would have guessed or you never would have expected. So I wouldn't necessarily see that as a disadvantage for what we're going to tackle in action research. The data collector can't ask the questions to clarify, so we just talked about that briefly. And if the questions with rating scales include 2 or more ideas, the results are unclear. So you need to really be specific and careful about the questions you ask and make sure that you're only getting at one topic and not, kind of starting to put things together that can be clumped and really not give you clean data back. Interviews are another valuable way of collecting data. You can do those one-on-one with individual students. Even if you're working one-on-one, maybe a couple of folks are working on a focus on increasing literacy with English language learners, where you are going to be doing more small group interaction. Doing an interview at the end of an instructional time frame would be very doable. It doesn't even have to take a lot of time, but it could be part of just kind of the recap or some summation of instruction with those learners, and use that to capture some of your data. I mentioned earlier, class meetings and focus groups can be helpful, and the interviews can be formal or they can be completely informal. They could be a quick interaction and a question that's asked as you are walking through and using proximity as students are working in the context of a classroom activity. So think about that. That can be a very handy way to collect your data. Just a few interview advantages, disadvantages. Again, advantages, you can probe, you can ask clarifying questions, you can ask students to elaborate. The disadvantage, sometimes you can't just interview everybody. That can be difficult depending on the size of your data collection for your class. You can build rapport with the respondents. Disadvantages, it can be time consuming. It can help in collecting the data from those who can't write their thoughts and feelings. Maybe that is a struggle due to the age of the students, or there may be a disability at hand. The downside is you don't have anonymity if that's something that's important to your study. Data can be gathered by audio tapes, so you can always go back and play it over again and make sure that you really captured what was stated. And then I don't see this as an issue for any of us, but respondents may fear statements will be used against them, or they may be challenged in sharing with you what they really feel. So that comfort and that trust, if it's not there, then that can be a challenge. Next up, I just want to share a couple of tools. We talked about shared data collection tools, and I mentioned that school psychologists are great resources, or maybe some of your special educators or even administrators that can be resources and share some of these types of data collection tools that maybe they've utilized or are aware of. But this is an example of a tool that I created when I was doing my doctoral research. And so as I went in and did classroom observations on tech-rich and non-tech classrooms, I would just go through and I was looking at the interactions. So when you see teacher question tally on the screen there and you see the student question tally, I was looking at how questions were happening. Was the teacher asking questions to individuals, groups, or whole class? And were the questions open or closed in nature? So was there a specific answer that they were looking for, or were they really trying to engage students in deeper thinking? So it was depth of knowledge that I was trying to measure there. Student questions, the same. I was looking at how engaged students were and whether or not they were really asking questions to the teachers or engaged in questioning each other or to the whole class. I will tell you that that was an area that I reflected on. It was probably not as useful to me because in the age of the students that I was working with, I didn't see a lot of student-initiated questions, particularly directed to the whole class. Students initiating questions, if they're in a small group, they could have been to the small group, but mainly they were directed to the teacher. So I learned from that. I probably wouldn't have included it in the future. I also looked at the number of minutes that were spent. So as a teacher kicked off the lesson, there might have been 15 minutes of direct instruction, providing directions, kind of setting the stage or developing the skill for what was happening. So that would always be common at the front of a lesson. I would look at the student-centered and how much time was there and how much time was in transition and if there was any need for classroom management. So that gave me kind of a nice data set of how much instructional time was truly on instruction versus management or transition. And then the last of that, just a few other areas, discipline, classroom interruptions, and so forth. But what I really loved was looking at time on task. So this is kind of my quick direction sheet. And again, you have this as a PDF, so you can look at it without the screencast. But basically, if you look at the codes, during that time that I was observing, I went into 5 minutes on the clock, and I simply marked on off-task behavior, and then I quantified that. So what that looked like on data collection is a very simple frame, and you could restructure this for however your classroom is, but each large square represents a child or a desk in the classroom where a child was seated. Each one of the dashes is a 30-second frame on the clock. So in 5 minutes, I had 30-second frames of time that I would scan the class, and if a student was off task, I'd mark it with a minus. And then totally, I would, at the end of the 5-minute time, I would total the number of minuses versus the number of pluses, and then I would total, and then each category, and then I could divide by the total number of observation frames, and that would give me a quantity, a quantified number that would allow me to calculate the percent of time on task. Questions about that? Reach out, let me know. I can walk you through that, or I can do a model of that in another video. But you're welcome to use that. It's a quick and easy way to just quantify on-task behavior. So with that, you want a high degree of time on task. I would just encourage you, if you find that you've got 85% of your students on task, or students are on task 85% of the time in that interaction, I would rather that be 99%. So think about what your target is. Documents. Mentioned briefly journals, diaries, case studies. SmartLearn talks about case studies and provides some examples in the text as well, so I won't go into that because you can read that component. And school records. I talked about, think about what already exists in terms of assessment performance. Some of you are doing, we've got one student that's looking at reading levels, so there's already tools that are utilized in that building to assess student reading level and progress on reading level. So those data sources that you may already have at your hands, how can they play into supporting your project and helping you know whether or not there's truly been growth? Behavior, grades, think about what kind of grades have you been collecting, and if you're implementing a change where maybe student product in the classroom that will be graded that goes into the grade book, that would give you some pre and post intervention comparison. So use what you have to your advantage. Research qualities. I want to think a little bit in terms of some of the big three that we will focus on. And as we develop our research plans and we start to get into how we're going to collect data, we're going to begin talking about generalizability, reliability, and validity. Your research must consider and adhere to all three. It's important. So generalizability, I think, can it be generalized what you do across settings and context? So an example would be, think like lesson design. There is a generalizability of a strong lesson planning format can be helpful across many different learning environments. So for years, that was Madeline Hunter lesson design, or that's the way I learned, and then I got into the 5E area because I was in science ed. no matter what, those types of instructional design tools could be generalized and work across settings and contexts because they were generalizable. They all had an objective for the learning. They all had some type of engagement or anticipatory set. They had a time for input. They had a time for modeling, guided practice, independent practice, and formative and summative assessment of learning. So those criteria for lesson design could be generalized across settings and repeated, which leads us into reliability. Is the design of your research, if you were to repeat it in different settings with the same population, will you find the same results? Is it repeatable? And then validity, does it measure what it's supposed to measure? So those are three things that we'll come back to as we get further into the data collection. But just be thinking about those because it is a good idea to think through those, especially when you're looking at existing research. You will see through the research base as you're developing the second section of the project this week, and that's the research-based support for change. You will see reliability, validity, and generalizability in the research that you're reviewing that you're going to use to help support your rationale for what you're going to do in your own classroom. I won't spend a lot of time on this topic because I've already touched on it a little bit in the opening of our video this week, but sharing of relevant research. So continue to go back through as you're developing your project, particularly Section 2, that research-based support for your change, and review the forum posts for the abstracts. As you look at that, and what was the research question in each study, what did they find and conclude, what research methods were utilized, and what data was collected, it'll help you get more ideas for your own. And I already alluded to the fact that the research methods, they may be something you'll find in the existing research that you can replicate. That's okay. That's good research. If you find something that worked for somebody else and it's going to help you make a positive change in your classroom, potentially for your learners, it's okay to apply that to your own study. So be keeping that in mind. So just a quick recap as we end the screencast for this week. For this week, you're going to review the additional action research and traditional research studies on your topic. So you're going to be looking at research-based previous studies that have already occurred, and you're going to use those pieces to develop your research-based support for change, your rationale for change. You're going to develop that in the second section of the project. You're going to be finalizing your topic and your research question. You're going to be drafting and submitting your project this week. The key pieces that you're going to be building on. In the introduction, you're going to provide an introduction. You're going to state your problem, and you're also going to look at the research question and provide a rationale for why you came to have that research question. Also in that introduction, you're going to talk about the context of the learning environment. You're going to introduce the learning environment. What are the demographics of your learners? Who are your learners? And why is this research ultimately important to you and to them? So the guidelines of this assignment are posted in additional research in Moodle for Session 3. I'll pop that open really quick right now. So you've got past the screencast. You've got a place to turn in the draft, and then right below that, assignment guide for introduction research-based support for change. So let me pull that into our screen so you can see. Each week that we have a draft due, I will give you kind of the quick overview of what that draft will entail. Every week you will see this, so it is meant to give you these pieces that are due this week, and then what is ahead of us. So only focus on the bold. This week, you may want to write the abstract, but you can't write the abstract because you don't know what your results are yet. So leave that out. You can put it as a placeholder if you really want that piece to sit in the project at the beginning. But number 2 and number 3 are what you're doing and working on. So here's kind of your flow. And this is taken right off the rubric for how your final project will be assessed in the introduction and also the research-based support for change. So as you develop this section, introduction and statement of the problem, you're going to include the information detailing the aspects of the study, the setting, your school, your classroom, the participants, the demographics, the percent of economically advantaged and disadvantaged, male, female, percent of students that are in special education, or if you're working with English language learners and that's important for you to detail, you can put that percentage in as well. This is a really easy piece to write because if you're smart about it, you can go on the Kansas side to the Kansas State Department of Education. Missouri, you can go to DESE. You can go into the building report card link, and the Kansas side, that's linked off the front page of KSDE. And you can look up your school and you can get all this data in one quick website, the demographics section for your school. Okay, you're going to give a description of the current climate and instructional practices within the classroom. Just write about your classroom. What is it like if I were to come into your classroom? Tell the reader what your classroom is like in terms of the climate. The importance of the study for the researcher, the importance of the study for your educational community. Then you're going to state your problem. Describe in detail what kind of problem that you're studying and what the research hopes to solve through your research. Who's affected by this? And in that case, are you focusing on the whole class, or are you looking at a small group of learners that you're targeting? Who or what's suspected of causing the problem? What do you think is at the heart of this? And what is your goal for the solution? What do you hope to reach? So you're basically going to write a rationale for change. And then at the end of that section, clearly state your research question. Okay. Some of the key pieces, and this is where I have you reading Chapter 8 in Mertler, and that is how you are actually doing your academic writing. I will be looking for this in the draft, and I'll give you feedback on it. I won't be punitive, but I will help you develop the writing here. But formal writing is required, so take care to avoid the use of I, me, and my statements, and that's going to be difficult for some of you. So the researcher sought to bring about change in whatever your topic is, versus I wanted to make sure my students were increasing the time on task. I don't use I statements, I don't talk about my kids, talk about the learners. So those are just some key pieces to keep the academic writing clean. Also, I will stress this, and it's also in the middle piece of the class, and I will say this over and over and over again. It'll be a stretch. When you're writing these early sections, make sure you stay in past tense throughout. The rationale for that is by the time you get to the last section of the project in December or May or wherever we're at in the sequence for the semester, you will be writing about what you achieved, what you found, and it will be in past tense because you will have completed the research or you're nearing the end of the research. At that point, if the reader's to pick this project up, or as you're using it for your defense or you're using it for your portfolio review, then you're going to have a project that is not coherent because it will have changed tense in the middle part of the project, starting out in present tense to past tense in the end. Keep it in past tense all the way throughout to help it flow and be cohesive. That is a key. The next section that you're going to work on is a draft this week, so this is a stretch, but hang in there. 2 sections due, is the research-based support for change. By the conclusion of this section, you should have at least 7 sources from published research cited in the narrative of this section. So you're going to write about what the existing research base provides that links to your research question and supports the change that you want to implement. So you're basically going to do a cited research section. For the highest level of rubric criterion for the research-based support for change, you need at least 7 research sources cited in this section. So if you don't have all 7 this week because it is a draft, that's okay. You will get a note from me that says, please continue to locate citations. You're at 4, you're at 5, you need to be at 7. So again, it's a draft and we'll keep that in mind, do your best. But I understand it's a draft and that you may need some additional time to continue to build that out, and that's okay if that flows into next week. All right, references, it's a good idea to go ahead and start a reference page. So you have a page break at the end of that research-based support for change section and start to build your references with your APA citations. Okay, formatting, APA needs to be followed. The sections and future sections of the draft continue to develop this week into a single document. As you do future drafts in the next week and the week after, when we start building the data collection plan and the data analysis methodologies, always turn in the full paper. Don't give me one section at a time because I will go back and reread to make sure that it flows and fits together. And sometimes I have questions and I want to review back, so I want it all in one place. So as you set each draft, make sure it is flowing through a single document. Don't do these as separate pieces. Okay. And also, per APA, I want you to insert the running head and page numbers in the top header of each page. If you need any help with that formatting, let me know and I'd be happy to send you a resource for that. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of where we're going for week 3. To look ahead, in week 4, we're going to get into data analysis and the presentation overview of the data. Session 5, we're going to have some individual teamwork, and that's where I will put you in research teams around common topics or grade levels, and we'll do a little bit of a writer's workshop so you get an opportunity to see what other people in like-minded research areas are doing and how they're tackling their project and their data collection plan, so you get some peer feedback in addition to my own and have more connection with your classmates and your peers. Session 6, we're going to be in the throes of data collection, so you will be actively at that point collecting data, and by session 7 you should be wrapping up your data collection, finalizing that, completing the last sections of the project, and that's where we start getting into our data analysis and reporting of results and our reflections and how we're going to share this with others. So that is where we're at in a nutshell. I am available if you have any questions. Don't forget Tuesday office hours. I'll have that posted in the middle so you can jump online if you've got any questions and you want to get into a live chat. You're also welcome to email me and or reach out and give me a call if you want to talk on the phone. So with that said, good luck this week on the first sections of the draft. I look forward to reading what you are thinking and can't wait to provide that feedback to you. Have a great week, everybody. Happy researching.